What's up, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. We're going to be reading Dreamland by Sam Quinones today, chapter 11, just one chapter today. It's kind of a longer one. We're going to be starting on page 56. Easier than Sugarcane. Jalisco, Nayarit. One afternoon in April 1996, a funeral procession left the village of Aquiles Cerdán in the state of Nayarit, Mexico. Dozens of people trudged uphill, heading north to the town of Jalisco, the county seat, blocking traffic on the highway that also led south down to the beach resort of Puerto Vallarta. A banda, a brass band of trumpets, clarinets, bass and snare drums, and a massive tuba, serenaded the marchers with Te vas, Angela Mijo, You're leaving, my angel. Men fired guns in the air and took turns shouldering the casket that continued the corpse of a man named David Tejeda. He grew up a ranchero kid, better off than some by rural Mexican standards, but by the time he died, his Andalusians and quarter horses were the finest animals in the country. He was also a master horse dancer. Horse dancing is a popular pastime among northwest Mexican rancheros. It involves spurring and prodding the horse to prance and hop in time to a banda's staccato beat. But the country's annual Fiera de Alote, corn fair, following the traditional horse parade that winds through Jalisco, David Tejeda would display his horse dancing prowess to the admiration and envy of all. Now, as the men from his family carried Tejeda's body to be buried, they also led his favorite animal, a white quarter horse named Palomo, saddled and riderless, and prodded it to dance as the banda played. For an hour, the procession moved up the highway, then over cobblestone streets to the Jalisco cemetery. David Tejeda was among the first from Jalisco County to sell heroin in the San Fernando Valley. Just as important, he was among the first to publicly display what black tar heroin could do for a ranchero kid. He built stables and attached them to the large new houses he also built for his family. I heard about David Tejeda well after I began piecing together the story of the Jalisco boys. By then, what began on the day that I stood on the banks of the Ohio River in Huntington, West Virginia, had turned into an obsession with the rancheros from this one small town in Jalisco, Nayarit. Thousands of Americans were addicted to the tar heroin the Jalisco boys sold that netted millions of dollars a month. I found nothing written about them, yet I could see they were changing drug use in many parts of the country. I wondered how they wound up in so many places: Memphis, Omaha, Myrtle Beach, Nashville, Indianapolis, and Minneapolis. They reminded me, in fact, of another group I'd heard of, the Herreras. The Herreras were Mexico's first vast drug trafficking ranchero family in the U.S. They lived in and around a rancho known aptly as Los Herreras, an isolated, roadless place in the mountains of Durango, founded in the late 1600s and accessible for centuries only on horseback. Like so many from the ranchos of Mexico, they were actually a clan made up of numerous intermarried families. Nevarez, Medina, Diaz, Villanueva, and Venegas were the other last names. They intermarried with the Corral family from the rancho Los Corrales. Law enforcement estimated the clan comprised 1,000 people, spreading across several ranchos in Durango, all involved in producing, transporting, or selling heroin. The first Herreras appear to have intended to work legitimately when they arrived in Chicago sometime in the 50s, but poppies grew well in the mountains of Durango. In time, they moved to heroin. Much of the U.S. market was then supplied by Turkey, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia half a world away, their dope coming through New York City. But after police dismantled the Turkish and European heroin network known as the French Connection in 1972, the Herrera clan grew into the most important source of heroin in much of the country, annually importing 7.5 tons of the brown powder known as Mexican mud. The Herreras were, quote, not really a cartel per se, it was an old-time organized crime family, said Leo Eriguin, a retired DEA agent I tracked down who infiltrated the clan in the early 80s. Most Herreras looked like auto mechanics, scruffy and unassuming, driving beater cars, he said. Eriguin used to buy from one Herrera who'd drive to the McDonald's meeting spot in a car so worn out that it burned oil and left a smoke cloud behind. One of the clan, Balthazar Nevarez Herrera, owned a beef slaughterhouse in Chicago. For a while, the clan shipped its heroin in small metal tubes they fed to cows in Mexico. When the cows reached Chicago, they were slaughtered and the tubes were retrieved, Aragon said. The Klan moved to Denver, Detroit, Dallas, Oklahoma City, LA, and many other towns. Each Klan member was an independent entrepreneur buying into the family heroin. A Chicago police investigation into the Herreras estimated it took $60 million in profits out of that town alone, funneling all that to Durango through shady currency exchange shops around South Chicago. The Klan used its money, in part, to build parks and roads other than stuff that tends to endear villagers and narcos in the mountains of northwest Mexico. Directing the Klan was its patriarch, Don Jaime Herrera Narvaez, a former police officer who never left Mexico. It's said that he had something to do with the reason that a Mexican ounce of heroin, known as a pedazo, or a piece, is actually 25 grams, not 28, which is the normal measure of an ounce. This difference has caused many disputes among buyers who, unaware of the difference, feel they're getting ripped off. Legend has it that Don Jaime had a large spoon holding 25 grams that he used to scoop heroin. That became the standard ounce in the Mexican heroin world. I never learned whether this legend, recounted by several older DEA agents who tracked the Herreras, was true. In 1985, Don Jaime, several brothers and cousins, and his son, Jaimito, along with dozens of other relatives, were busted. Many went to prison. That didn't end the Klan's activities, but they didn't have quite the same power. The shorter distances from Latin America to the U.S., which allowed the region to remain more competitive in many agricultural commodities, eventually pushed out the Turkish and the Asian heroin. Colombians began introducing their brown powder to the eastern half of the U.S. in the 80s, along with their more famous cocaine. It was much cheaper than the white powder from Asia. Other Mexicans, especially the Sinaloans, began sending black tar heroin north to the western U.S. in the early 80s, replacing the Mexican mud. Even as the Herreras played a reduced supply role, heroin's price in America trended downward. Black tar, the most rudimentary form of heroin, was especially cheap to make. With Mexico so close by, tar's price could keep dropping. This, as I found out, was crucial to the story I came upon as I discovered the Jalisco Boys networks. The Jalisco Boys seemed like a modern version of the Herreras and is hard to get a handle on. I sifted through shards of information about their hazy underworld that came to me from indictments and interviews with addicts and cops and prosecutors, DEA and FBI agents, and imprisoned Jalisco traffickers. Slowly a picture emerged of how a small town of sugarcane farmers grew by the early 21st century into the most proficient group of drug traffickers America has ever seen. The first migrants of Jalisco settled in San Fernando Valley, in Van Nuys, Panorama City, and Canoga Park. Many Jalisco migrants were there illegally but worked legitimate jobs in construction, landscaping, and restaurants. However, by the early 80s, a few families set to selling black tar heroin on valley streets and in parks. The opium poppy grew bountifully in the mountains above Jalisco, and these families had relatives who'd mastered the folk craft of cooking opium goo into black tar. Tar had the advantage of being moldable, like clay, and thus easy to shape into, say, the battery compartment of a boombox. Their tar was also potent and very condensed, and, as it was heroin, which addicts needed every day, it lent itself to retail, where the real profit was. The quantities needed were relatively small. A courier could take across a kilo in a purse or strapped under clothing. Jalisco families living in Tijuana hired themselves out as these couriers. The first Jalisco heroin traffickers mostly hailed from a single clan, many of whose members bore the last name Tejeda. Back in Jalisco County, the Tejeda clan spread across several ranchos in webs of cousins, sisters, uncles, brothers, and in-laws. The last names also included Sanchez, Diaz, Ibarria, Lizama, Lopez, Navarro, Cienfuegos, Lerma, Bernal, Garcia, Hernandez, and others knitted together through blood, marriage, and rancho life, the children of farmers who also raised sugarcane, coffee, corn, and cattle. They were not the poorest of Jalisco's peon farm workers. On the contrary, They were people who had access to enough money to get up north, pay a coyote, and look for new kinds of work, said a Tepic professional I spoke with, who is from Jalisco. Jalisco had many well-known sugarcane families. They were why Jalisco was first in production of sugarcane in the state of Nayarit. Their sons were the ones who started this heroin business in the 80s and 90s. These parents tried to teach the sons agriculture. The sons worked in the fields. It's really hard work. They didn't want to keep on doing what their dads did. They saw that heroin was a good business, and so they began to leave. It's easier to make money in the business than to continue working sugarcane, he said. In the early 80s, before cell phones or beepers, these Tejedas would stand on the street or in some San Fernando Valley park. Buyers approached and the dealer would cut off a piece of heroin with a small knife. That they lived in the San Fernando Valley, I suspected, made their story possible. They were far from the Sinaloans. Sinaloa is in the state of Mexico where drug trafficking began. Sinaloans tend to be brash, brazen, violent. Other Mexicans hold them in something like awe. Sinaloans came to dominate the east side of LA County in the 1980s. The tiny suburbs southeast of LA, Paramount, Huntington Park, Bell Gardens, Southgate, and others, began as bedroom communities for ex-GIs from World War II, but by the late 80s, these cities were solidly Mexican, and Sinaloan in particular. When that happened, these towns also became distribution terminals for Sinaloan drugs to cities across the U.S. But the San Fernando Valley is far away, across the hills in the northwest part of LA, and out there, Sinaloans aren't as numerous. Other traffickers had room to expand. Among the first Jalisco boys to do so was David Tejeda. He was the oldest of 6 sons of a wealthy sugarcane farmer in the rancho of Aquiles Cerdan, wealthy by local standards anyway. His family had land, cattle, horses, and houses even before he went north to sell dope. David Tejeda was a light-skinned guy with a fondness for white cowboy hats and leather jackets and epaulets in the style of the slain narco-bandolier Chalino Sanchez. Tejeda lived in Canoga Park and drank at the Majestic, the Van Nuys bar that was a favorite of Jalisco dealers like Enrique's uncles. He fought a lot, had a lot of girlfriends, and made a few enemies along the way. But he gave jobs in the San Fernando Valley to poor kids from back home. A lot of people respected him for that. "We all dreamed of coming up here to work for him," said one Jalisco trafficker I talked to in the U.S. prisons. "I went to him and asked for work. I was like 13 or 14. He said no, that I was too young. Many kids came and knocked on his door with the same request. I have cousins and friends who came and did work with him." LA was a hive of gang activity during the late 80s and early 90s. In some neighborhoods, a different gang controlled every few blocks. Crack was big. Mobs of young men sold it by standing on LA streets. Gangs began levying taxes on these street dealers. About this time, the Jalisco boys took their heroin trade off the street, out of the parks, and went to cars. Addicts were given a phone number to call. When they called, they were told where to meet a driver. The driver was directed to waiting clients by codes sent to them via beepers. Cars and beepers allowed a heroin crew access to a broader client base and made the Jalisco boys less obvious to police. In cars, dealers avoided gang taxation and the violence that accompanied street crack trade. With the rudimentary delivery model in place, business boomed. Word of the business spread throughout Jalisco. More young men arrived from the town. They copied the system. They called their business tienditas, little stores. Owning a business was a narcotic itself for young rancho kids who had nothing. Some drivers learned the business with an established cell, then went out and opened their own. Each cell was an independent business competing with others. Shootouts were unthinkable. Violence brought police attention. Guns earned long prison time. Plus, everyone knew each other from Jalisco, so violence would have created repercussions back home. A sell and let sell ethos took hold, and by the early 90s, Jalisco heroin tienditas quietly crawled all over the valley. As more people entered the business, profits dwindled. Police wised up and arrested several dealers. About that time, in 1990, or maybe a year or two later it appears, David Tejeda discovered Hawaii. He'd been selling to addicts who came over from Hawaii. Now he moved a crew of drivers there and used those addict customers as guides to this new market where heroin fetched triple the price. Slowly, others followed his lead and Jalisco dealers expanded. Before long, they were also in Panama, San Diego, and Portland, then in Las Vegas. Tejeda, quote, was okay with others starting up their own tienditas. There's plenty for everybody, he thought, said another trafficker. But that wasn't always true. Most cities then had a small universe of heroin addicts, who were usually old and poor. A crew new to the town had to steal customers from the crews that were already there. The zero-sum game that ensued taught the Jalisco boys the importance of branding and marketing. To keep customers, they learned to emphasize customer service, discounts, the convenience and safety of delivery. They had to ensure their dope was always good quality, meaning uncut and potent. The competition for a limited number of addicts also kept them moving on through the 90s in search of new, less saturated markets. When they did this, they defined the norms of Mexican drug trafficking. Most Mexican traffickers naturally followed the immigrants from their home states. That was astute and common sense, for no immigrant group has settled in such numbers in so many parts of America as Mexicans had by the end of the 1990s. Mexican immigrants were in rural areas where local police were often monolingual and understaffed. Those areas had cash-only businesses, Mexican restaurants and money wiring services that could be used to launder cash. By the 90s, small towns and communities in rural Colorado, Georgia, and Arkansas where Mexicans worked in meat plants became major hubs for traffickers, places where they divided the dope loads they brought in and with which they supplied much larger towns. Mexican traffickers did this by following the immigrants. Thus, by the 1990s, for example, it was possible for Sinaloan traffickers to find drug markets in many parts of America using Sinaloan immigrant communities as their point of contact and place to blend in. Michoacan traffickers did the same in many U.S. regions where Michoacan immigrants became essential parts of the local economy. But Nayarit is Mexico's fifth smallest state with barely 1 million people. Its migrants are few and have congregated mainly in LA and Reno. To find new heroin markets, the Jalisco boys would have to move where they had no natural family or rancho connection. And that's exactly what they did. Like Spanish conquistadors venturing beyond the comfortable hometown networks they became part of, the Jalisco boys' DNA. To do this, though, they needed the guides. Spaniards relied on Indians who hated the Aztecs to guide them across the New World to Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, now Mexico City. Junkies did the same for the Jalisco boys. The Jalisco boys supplied these junkies habits in exchange for help in moving into a new area and in renting apartments, registering cell phones, and buying cars. You get one person to show you around and pass around the phone number, and it's like bees to a hive, one imprisoned Jalisco boy told me, quote, they all know each other. It's like having a scout. That's what happened in Las Vegas. A female addict there told some of the families, I know people in Tennessee. So they went with her to Memphis. It became one of the biggest markets for a while. They went to towns with large Mexican populations where the boys could blend in and where no gang or mafia controlled the drug trade. But junkies got them there and found them their first customers. Junkies allowed the Jalisco boys to expand far beyond where they might have they only relied on Nayarit immigrant connections. With faith in the addictive power of their dope, the Jalisco boys harnessed these junkies who led them to rich new markets where almost no Nayarits lived, but where thousands of middle-class white kids were beginning to dope up on prescription opiate painkillers. Junkies could track the telltale signs through the streets of a new city to the hidden customers that the Jalisco boys might never otherwise have found. Junkies knew the slang and could read looks of desperation. Most importantly, and crucial to the expansion of the Jalisco boys, was that junkies could navigate America's methadone clinics. The painkiller known as methadone was synthesized by German scientists in an effort to make Nazi Germany medicinally self-reliant as it prepared for war. The Allies took the patent after the war, and Eli Lilly Company introduced the drug in the U.S. in 1947. U.S. doctors identified it as a potential aid to heroin addicts. That idea was taken up by Dr. Vincent Dole, an addiction specialist at the Rockefeller Institute in New York City. Methadone, Dole found, was the only opiate whose addicts did not demand increasing doses every few hours. Instead, they were happy with the same dose once a day, which could carry them through the next 24 hours. Methadone addicts could actually discuss topics unrelated to dope. This was not true of heroin addicts, whom Dole found tediously single-minded in their focus on the drug. Dole believed that addicts could be maintained on methadone indefinitely, and that with one dose a day, they could function as normal human beings. In 1970 in New York City, he opened the first methadone clinic for heroin addicts. Dole believed that rehabilitation was dependent on human relationships, group therapy, 12-step meetings, and the like. But as a last resort, for those who defied all efforts to kick the habit, methadone, Dole believed, could be a crutch, helping them through life. President Richard Nixon permitted methadone as a treatment for heroin addiction, which plagued many soldiers returning from the Vietnam War. By the late 1970s, federally regulated methadone clinics were popping up around the country. These clinics quietly showed how a narcotic might be dispensed legally in a safe, crime-free environment. Methadone stabilized an addict and allowed him to find a job and repair damaged relationships. There were also no dirty needles, no crime, and no addicts knew that they could be robbed at clinics. What's more, methadone undercut and replaced the street heroin dealer's trade with a clean, well-lighted place for opiates. Everyone was better off. Methadone clinics opened before sunrise. One reason for this was that many addicts looking for trades easier to enter had become construction workers, carpenters, and painters. They had to get to those jobs early. Methadone users were like ghosts, showing up early in the morning for years on end, drinking their dose, and silently going about their lives. In time, though, methadone became a battlefield between those who thought it should be used to wean addicts off opiates and those, like Vincent Dole, who saw it as a lifelong drug, like insulin for diabetics. One strategy or other might have well worked, but the worst of both emerged at many clinics. Methadone was often dispensed as if the goal was kicking the habit with small doses, but as methadone clinics became for-profit affairs, many cut the counseling and therapy that might help their patients kick opiates altogether. Critics could be forgiven for seeing some clinic owners as drug dealers, stringing patients out for years and charging 20 or 30 times what the drug actually cost, which was about 50 cents a dose. In 1990, the U.S. General Accounting Office reported that half the clinics were poorly managed, unaccountable, and provided little counseling or aftercare. The result was that many methadone clinics maintained core populations of opiate addicts in cities all across the country, but on doses that were too small and usually without much therapeutic support. Addicts who weren't given high enough doses craved other opiates later in the afternoon after the clinics closed. They had to find their dope elsewhere, usually on the street, and thus remained tied to the heroin underworld. At clinics that combined low doses and insufficient rehab therapy, addicts took to using methadone and heroin interchangeably. Methadone was a better alternative to weak powder heroin, which was more expensive and available only in dangerous housing projects or skid rows. But maintaining large numbers of people on any kind of opiate, particularly on low doses, made them easy prey for someone with a more efficient and convenient opiate delivery system. For years, though, no one could conceive of such a thing, a system of retailing street heroin that was cheaper than, as safe as, and more convenient than a methadone clinic. But in the mid-1990s, that's exactly what the Jalisco boys brought to towns across America. They discovered that methadone clinics were, in effect, game preserves. Methadone clinics gave Jalisco boys the footholds in the first western U.S. cities as they expanded beyond the San Fernando Valley in the early 90s. Every new cell learned to find a methadone clinic and give away free samples to the addicts. One Jalisco boy in Portland told authorities of a training that his cell put new drivers through. They were taught, he said, to lurk near methadone clinics, spot an addict, and follow him. They'd then tap him on the shoulder and ask directions to some place. Then they'd spit out a few balloons. Along with the balloons, they'd give the addict a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Call us if we can help you out. The value of each Jalisco heroin tiendita was in its list of customers. Quote, "This is how they would build and maintain it," said Steve Migrant, a Portland area prosecutor. "It was an ongoing recruiting practice. In the same way a corporate business would identify customers. They'd lose people along the way, so they were constantly engaged in this." In time, most cells developed addicts they could trust, and some of these, in turn, helped tiendita owners expand to new cities in exchange for dope. Some of their junkie guides became legend down in Jalisco. In Cincinnati, I spoke with a girl in Lower Price Hill neighborhood, home to transplanted Appalachians and overrun with heroin. She had been rustling up businesses for a series of Jalisco dealers intent on shaping a customer list as they came and went over the years. The girl was, in her own words, a known quantity down there in Jalisco, a town she had never visited. Jalisco boys who were just getting started in Cincinnati asked for her, looked her up, and pushed dope in her face, wanting her to help in establishing heroin routes through the Cincinnati metro area. It made kicking the habit almost impossible. "They can't even say my name, but they tell them down there, ask for some white girl, Lower Price Hill. One guy even came with a note with my name spelled on it. Someone had written my name and misspelled it," she said. "Over these years, I get out of jail or rehab, and they're out there looking for me. People will say, 'How do you always got this connection?' I don't know. It's not like I call Mexico and say, 'Can you send me a guy?' But it's always there." One prolific addict turned guide was a woman named Tracy Jefferson. Jefferson was a longtime drug user and manic depressive from Salem, Oregon. She hooked up with Luis Padilla, a Jalisco dealer in Reno, Nevada in 1993. Padilla Pena had come to the U.S. in 1990 and found work in Las Vegas with the heroin crew run by a friend from the Tejada Sanchez clan. From there, he went off on his own. His big break was meeting Jefferson. Over the next 2 years, she helped Padilla Pena and his family carve out heroin markets in Salem, Denver, Seattle, Colorado Springs, Oklahoma City, and Omaha, usually by enrolling herself in methadone clinics and giving away free black tar to the clinic's clients she met. From Omaha, Jefferson said when she testified in federal court, she and the family were scouting Kansas City, St. Louis, and Des Moines. They would drop a town that didn't generate at least $2,000 daily in profit. For this reason, she testified, they passed on Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Yakima in Vancouver and Washington. Another such guide was a kid from Mexico who grew up in Reseda. He didn't use drugs, but he had something else the Jalisco boys needed. He was bilingual. He was from Mexico, but was raised in the San Fernando Valley. In Reseda, he met many Jalisco immigrants. In 1995, he was 17 when a new cell leader hired him to work in Maui, Hawaii. "None of them spoke English. That's why I was important to them," he said. "There were a lot of things they couldn't do. When I got there, I helped them expand." By then, Hawaii had 2 Jalisco cells, one owned by David Tejeda, and the other by a man named Tonio Races, who was from a small rancho in El Molinal, near the hills of Jalisco. Back in Jalisco, people say that Tonio Races aimed to be somebody in the drug world. Some say he envied David Tejeda. The story goes that Tejeda was owed $400,000 for product by a man from the rancho of Pantanal who didn't want to pay. This man was backed up by Tonio Races. One day in 1996, outside a Jalisco dance club, Tejeda met with his rivals. From there, they moved to a coffee warehouse Races owned, and in a dispute over money, Tejeda was shot to death by Races men under a guayobo tree. No one was arrested. Vaqueros Musical, a local band, recounted Tejeda's death in the way of a corrido. He got a call, they say, from a cellular. "David, come to the Miguel's bar down here and I'll pay you." Thursday, 4th of April, 1996, they got him when he wasn't expecting it. They shot him point blank with AK-47s. 3 years later, Tonio Races was shot to death at a cemetery where Tejeda was buried. The way I heard the story, his enemies killed a boy who worked for him. At the boy's funeral, mourners paid city police to let them shoot guns in the air at the cemetery, but during the ceremony, state police arrived, presumably allied with the Tejedas. A shootout erupted between state police and armed mourners. A commandant died, so did Tonio Races. Vaqueros Musical recorded another corrido. But David Tejedo's murder was the important one of the story of the Jalisco boys and the black tar heroin in America. His extended family had hundreds of relatives. He'd shown poor families they too could rise by selling heroin retail in the U.S. Younger guys naturally went to him for advice. He supplied many of them, as they expected, beyond the San Fernando Valley. Tejeda's death had a strangely liberating effect on his extended family and other Jalisco crews. When he was alive, a lot of people depended on him because he had everything going for him, said the kid from the Reseda. They didn't have to figure out how to do things for themselves, but once he was killed, they had to start doing things on their own. They didn't have nobody to depend on. Forced now to become more intrepid, quote, everybody scattered everywhere. So we'll finish chapter 12 probably later today or tomorrow. It's called Just a Phone Call Away. That's page 68. Hope you're enjoying the book, guys. Keep fighting that good fight out there.